You guys ready to get in the Word? If you want to follow along in your own Bible, we're going to be in Revelation chapter 6 this morning. So feel free to turn to Revelation chapter 6, whether you got a physical Bible like me or got one on your phone, something like that. And of course, you know, we're going through the entire book of Revelation, and we have entered the seal section. And we're going to be looking at the first four seals this morning that have to do with the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Anyone ever hear that phrase before, the four horsemen of the apocalypse? Well, that's the title of the sermon this morning, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Now, the last two Sundays, you know, we unpacked Revelation 4 and 5. And the setting of those two chapters is the throne room in the highest heaven, right, where God's full presence dwells. And everything that happens through the rest of Revelation, it has its beginning in that throne room, that control center of all existence. So in this sense, that the audience has a great grasp of what is going on in chapters 4 and 5 of Revelation, that is very important for understanding what happens next. In chapter 4, we saw how 4 cherubs and 24 angelic orders or elders surrounding the throne. We saw that it was a picture of heaven that was still structured according to Old Covenant administration, as it was ruled by these 24 angelic elders. There is song, but it is only by the 4 cherubs, and there's no accompaniment of music. But then in chapter 5, there is a massive shift that has huge implications for the entirety of the rest of the book of Revelation. In that chapter, John witnesses the approach of the Lamb of God to the throne. He sees the prophecy of Daniel chapter 7, the approach of the Son of Man to the Ancient of Days to receive an everlasting kingdom. He sees it play out right before his very eyes. In essence, he is taken back in time to see the ascension of Jesus from heaven's perspective. He has seen it from earth. He had joined in the praises with his fellow disciples on earth 30 years earlier, but now he witnesses it from the other side of the firmament, and he witnesses the praises of all of the host of heaven. And if you can remember last week, once Christ came to the throne that he would share with his Father, heaven erupted in loud praise. 10,000 times 10,000 and thousands of angels began to worship the Lamb. And the angelic elders began to add music to their praise as they began to pluck their harps. As Jesus approached the throne to receive a sealed scroll that would move history forward into the Messianic age, which was a cause of great rejoicing for John, Jesus was described as the Lion of the tribe of Judah and the Root of David, meaning he was truly and fully qualified to take that seat on David's throne. Yet in appearance, though he is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, and though he is the Root of David, John says that when he looked to behold him, what he saw was that he saw a lamb as though it had been slain, right? And it's kind of a creepy looking lamb. It had 7 eyes and it had 7 horns, right? Picturing the fullness of power of this lamb and the fullness of vision or the fullness of knowledge, the omniscience of this lamb. So Jesus' worthiness to take the most exalted position in all of existence stemmed from the fact that he laid down his life for the world's redemption. Aren't you glad? Only he, Jesus, is worthy to take the scroll that would bring the kingdom into its fullness and loose the 7 seals that was holding back the kingdom's contents. So the opening of the 7 seals is the theme of Revelation 6, 7, and the beginning of Revelation 8. This morning we're going to look at the loosing of the first 4 seals. This section of Revelation, like I said, it's called the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So let's begin in verse 1 of chapter 6. Now I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures saying with a voice like thunder, "Come and see." And I looked, and behold, a white horse. He who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him. And he went out conquering and to conquer. When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature saying, "Come and see." Another horse, fiery red, went out, and it was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth. Or the word, like I said, anytime you see earth, you can just read it as land. To take peace from the land. And that people should kill one another. And there was given to him a great sword. When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come and see." So I looked, and behold, a black horse. And he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine." When he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature saying, "Come and see." So I looked, and behold, a pale horse, or as the Tyndale version says, a green horse. A lot of other translations just say a pale green horse. And the name of him who sat on it was Death, and Hades followed with him, and power was given to them over a fourth of the earth, to kill, or the land, a fourth of the land, to kill with sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beasts of the earth. All right. So before we unpack what each of these 4 horses signify, let's begin by looking at the biblical background of these colored spiritual horses. And what would have gone through the minds of the audience that initially received the book of Revelation, an audience, a church that was more thoroughly steeped in the scriptures than most of our churches today? Basically, the question is, what is the biblical background of these creatures? We first meet heavenly horses in the Bible in the story of the prophet Elijah, a prophet that was called to preach to the northern kingdom of Israel right before it fell to the kingdom of Assyria. A prophet who was calling out a remnant and whose ministry pictured the later ministry of Jesus. One unique aspect of Elijah's life is that he didn't die, right? Anyone remember that? But he was received into heaven. Remember how he was received? By a heavenly chariot of fire. Let's read it, 2 Kings 2:11. Then it happened as they continued on and talked that suddenly a chariot of fire appeared with horses of fire and separated the two of them, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. So here we see horses of fire. The veil was taken down between the physical and spiritual world, and man for a brief moment was given a glimpse of Elijah's escort into the heavenly realm. Just as the poor man in Jesus' parable was carried by angels to Abraham's bosom, so this man was carried by a chariot of fire that was pulled by horses of fire. Now, not long after Elijah was taken into heaven by fire, we get a glimpse of even more horses of fire in the ministry of his disciple, Elisha. And when Elisha was surrounded by an enormous Syrian army with many chariots, right, many iron chariots, and all looked bleak for him and his servant as they are in the city of Dothan, well, Elisha, he makes a remarkable statement to his servant. This is what he says in 2 Kings 6:16. So he answered, "Do not fear, for those who are with us," Elisha and his servant, "are more than those who are with them." That giant army surrounding the entire city with a bunch of chariots. Verse 17. And Elisha prayed and said, "Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see." Then the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. So though their safety in this situation looked impossible from a natural perspective, Elisha's servant was given a vision of a heavenly army with heavenly horses that were fighting on their behalf. And ultimately, the entire Syrian army sent against Elisha was struck with blindness and utterly defeated. These heavenly horses spoke of salvation for God's people, for his remnant, and judgment for God's enemies. Well, the heavenly horses really come into focus, and what Revelation is really drawing on is not just those stories of Elijah and Elisha, but really the colored horses that we find in the book of Zechariah. Now, if anyone knows the prophet Zechariah, you know that he was one of the two prophets that was called by God alongside the prophet Haggai to prophesy during the rebuilding of the second temple, right? They had just come back out of exile from Babylon, and now Zechariah and Haggai are raised up by God to prophesy to the people to rebuild the temple. And the first part of Zechariah has to do with 7 night visions that he is given, all of which have this theme of rebuilding the temple. And in the first and last of the night visions, guess what we see? Zechariah has a vision of different colored horses. Let me just read a few verses of Zechariah 1, verse 8. I saw by night, and behold, a man riding on a red horse, and it stood among the myrtle trees in the hollow, and behind him were horses, red, sorrel, that's just like a chestnut reddish brown, and white. Then I said, my Lord, what are these? So the angel who talked with me said to me, I will show you what they are. And the man who stood among the myrtle trees answered and said, these are the ones whom the Lord has sent to walk to and fro throughout the earth. So in this first night vision, Zechariah sees a scene of red, white, and reddish brown horses that are pasturing in the pastures of heaven. These colors make us, the red and the white and the reddish brown, they make us think of fire, right? They are the horses that likely were there in Elisha's time. And there is a man, likely an angelic general, who's sitting on one of the red horses. This makes me think of the angel of the Lord who met Joshua right before the battle of Jericho when they were beginning to conquer the promised land. And the frustrating thing to Zechariah when he sees this vision is that these heavenly horses aren't doing anything. They're just out to pasture. They aren't engaged in battle. So he cries out a little later, how long? Just as John, as we saw in Revelation 5, what does he do? He begins to weep because no one can open the scrolls and loose those 4 horsemen from the seal. Zechariah wanted to see these heavenly steeds moving to help Israel rebuild their temple, which had become stalled because the people were believing lies and rumors were spreading throughout the land, and the temple wasn't being built as fast as it should be. Well, in the last night vision, in Zechariah 6, Zechariah finally begins to see these horses move into war. This is Zechariah 6, verse 1. Then I turned and raised my eyes and looked, and behold, 4 chariots were coming from between 2 mountains, and the mountains were mountains of bronze. With the first chariot were red horses, with the second chariot black horses, with the third chariot white horses, and with the fourth chariot dappled horses, strong steeds. So what's going on here? What are these chariots going in between 2 bronze mountains? Well, many scholars believe the 2 bronze mountains here are the 2 bronze pillars in the temple that God is riding out from his throne room in the Holy of Holies into the world, ready to go to battle. Later in Zechariah in chapter 10, God's people are identified as his majestic horse in battle, with God himself being the rider of that horse. That the way these heavenly horses affect change in the earth is through his people. We are the horses of the Lord. And this seems to be the background of Revelation chapter 6. God is ready to send out his heavenly steeds again to effect a change on the land. He is the rider of the horses, and in some sense, these horses represent the people of God. Just as the horses were sent out for the rebuilding of the temple under Zechariah, so they are sent out in Revelation for the rebuilding of the final temple, the church of God, the new Jerusalem, you and me. And once this temple is finished being rebuilt, as Jews and Gentiles are woven together into one new man in Christ Jesus, then the old temple that was in Jerusalem, as we've learned this year, guess what happened in AD 70? It came crashing down, right? So the horses in Revelation 6, they facilitate both of these things, the building of the new temple and the tearing down of the old. They facilitate the building of the new creation and the tearing down of the old creation. Now we're going to break it down, and I hope this makes a little more sense to you. So let's look at it horse by horse. Let's read verses 1 and 2 again. The white horse. Now I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures saying with a voice like thunder, "Come and see." Remember, there's four living creatures, the four cherubs. So each one in turn invites John to see one of the four horses. Verse 2. And I looked, and behold, a white horse. He who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. Now the first thing I want us to notice is when these horses begin their ride. When does the Lamb begin to open up the seals? Right after he ascended into heaven, right? Isn't that what Revelation 5 says? He ascends to heaven. He comes to the Ancient of Days in fulfillment of Daniel 7. He receives a scroll from the hand. And right away, he doesn't wait. He just begins to peel back the seals, right? In other words, it appears that the horsemen begin to ride right after the ascension of Jesus Christ in AD 33. Now, while some Christians argue that the seven seals, the seven trumpets, and the seven bowls are all speaking of the same events in Revelation, just in a different language, that doesn't seem to be the case to me for a variety of reasons, and we'll see it. But one of the reasons is that there's a historical trajectory in the book of Revelation. While there are some similarities between the seals, trumpets, and bowls, they are not synonymous. The seals open the book, the trumpets proclaim the contents of the book, and the bowls apply those contents, the woes and the lamentations. While the bowls primarily have to do with the Jewish war and the destruction of the temple from AD 66 to AD 70, the seals have more to do with events that take place right after the ascension and right after Pentecost. So let's consider that perspective here. The Lamb loosed one of the seals. Now last week I mentioned how this heavenly scroll likely had 7 wax seals on it. Each seal would be about the size of the palm of your hand and would be rolled out on wax with a cylinder engraved with a picture that pointed to the contents of the book. We might imagine the first seal here being that of white wax with a horse imprinted on the seal. The Lamb breaks the seal, and John sees a white horse. He who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. Now, of course, this is a heavenly vision, right? John wasn't expecting members from the 7 churches to see literal white, red, black, and green horses